Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to discuss about the fact that recently many saw me perform the Thelemic ritual known as the Star Ruby as a form of exorcism in the most recent Sam and Colby's video. And by many, I mean that as of today, that video has been seen by over 6 million people. That is genuinely mind-boggling to me. So I was brought in to cleanse an old farmhouse on Pendle Hill after a heavy-duty summoning ritual. In that dramatic context, the ritual I performed functioned as a banishing and as an exorcism, purging the space of any negative or chaotic influences. As I will explain, the Star Ruby is far more than a simple ghost-busting ceremony. In this video here, I will break down what the Star Ruby actually is, why I choose it for the investigation, and why I am convinced that while it actually absolutely works as a banishing rite, even as an exorcism, it contains much deeper layers of symbolism and power. And we'll compare it briefly with other banishing rituals, like the famous lesser banishing ritual of the Pentagram, and even the Catholic exorcism, just to give a little bit more context. A quick word for any Thelemic purists. This is not a definitive explainer. The finer points of this ritual are disputed. And what follows is my reading. Take what serves and leave the rest. I would like also to point out that this video is for the curious who want a clear first step into Thelema and magic. This is what grips you. Well, just know that the rabbit hole runs far deeper than you think. Let's start with the origins and purpose of the Star Ruby. But before we do that, if I can ask you a little favor to like, subscribe, hype this video, share it with your friends, leave a comment. All the things that help this channel keep on growing. We are on a upward trajectory, and I thank you all for the support you showed me in the last few weeks. So, Crowley introduced the Star Ruby over a century ago as a new form of a pentagram ritual. In fact, Crowley described the Star Ruby as the new and more elaborate version of the banishing ritual of the pentagram, and thus placed it squarely as Thelema's upgrade to the classic LBRP, which is the shorthand version for, lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram. This was used by the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. The ritual, the Star Ruby, was first published in 1913 as chapter 25 of Crowley's Book of Lies, and later revised in 1929 for magic in theory and practice. Crowley intended it to carry forward the framework of the LBRP, but infuse it with symbolism of his new Thelemic philosophy and the Aeon of Horus, the new era of Crowley's cosmology. Crowley's high opinion of the Star Ruby is evident in his writings. In Magic in Theory and Practice, he even asserted the banishing ritual of the pentagram, as now rewritten in Liber 333, chapter 25, is the best to use. And that it means the best to use as a banishing before any magical work. He also listed it in his curriculum for students, suggesting that they neglect not this ritual in this practice. However, he wasn't necessarily claiming it was better at banishing in a practical sense, but rather it was more elaborately tailored to express Thelemic concept, meaning it encodes the mystical principles of Thelema in its words and gestures. Interestingly, despite authoring it, Crowley himself often stuck with the old LBRP in his day-to-day use. For instance, he taught the LBRP to new students until later in his life. The Star Ruby, though, might have been some sort of theoretical or ritual experiment for him, or, potentially, it was reserved for more advanced work, but he certainly endorsed it in writing. This historical context, shows us that the Star Ruby stands on the shoulders of the venerable tradition of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and yet it carries on a uniquely Thelemic flair. So now you might be wondering, why did I choose the Star Ruby for the Sam and Colby investigation? Well, the scenario was this. Sam and Colby and their teams had just performed, under the guidance of Roxanne, a local British traditional witch, a heavy ritual summoning the devil in a haunted farmhouse up on Pendle Hill, which is one of the most active and paranormal locations in all of Britain. So the atmosphere was charged, and my job was to banish or exorcise any lingering presence, chaotic presence, malevolent presence. At the time, I didn't know what to expect, really, and to ensure everyone's safety. So in essence, I needed a reliable ritual to clear the space of every evil spirit, and those are the very words built right at the beginning of the Star Ruby. Before we delve into that, if you're curious about my experience with Sam and Colby, their teams, with and whatever happens on Pendle Hill, check in the description below my interview with Pythian Priestess on her channel. So back at those words encoded at the beginning of the Star Ruby. At the opening of the Star Ruby, the magician performs a forceful expulsion, crying out, this is Greek for away all evil spirits, in a nutshell, more or less. It is effectively an exorcism phase, famously akin to a line in the Bible, "Get behind me, Satan." In fact, this exact Greek formula is said to have been used in the Greek Orthodox Church's own exorcism ritual. So by incorporating that command, the Star Ruby directly addresses any negative or impure forces and thrusts them out at the very start. This made it a perfect choice for the situation. It's dramatic, it's authoritative, and steeped in tradition, which helped assure everyone present that a serious cleansing was underway. And beyond the cool factor of doing a cruelty ritual on camera, and I mentioned before that it's very hard to capture on camera what a ritual really does, because you are not there. You're not feeling the change in the air. You're not feeling the pressure lifting, etc. I was still confident of its efficacy. In fact, I always found it highly effective for resetting any spiritual atmosphere at any location. So after hours of ghost hunting and an actual conjuration ritual that night, that farmhouse on top of Pendle Hill was spiritually activated. People were very rattled. I don't know how much it shows in Sam and Colby's videos. And as I said in Pythian Priestess interview, they filmed for 7 hours. I was there for 3.5 hours. What you see is 1 hour, recorded and cut material. So just to give you an idea, I can tell you they were definitely rattled, right? And thus, even I experienced strange phenomena here and there, in the form especially of disembodied dog barks in a place where there were no animals for miles. The Star Ruby allowed me then to quickly assert control and restore balance, possibly closing any gates or any energies that were left, to wander on their own. So, effectively, this is essentially the same thing as performing an exorcism, but let's say in a Western esoteric tradition style. And thus, rather than invoking Jesus Christ or a saint, like it would happen in a Catholic exorcism, I invoke the divine names of Thelema and the powers of the pentagram and the hexagram, more on that soon, pretty much to chase out the chaos. In short, what I did, I used the Star Ruby in that video because it's a powerful banishing ritual. As an aside, while I did not explain this in the video to keep things more streamlined for Sam and Colby's mainstream audience, I am in fact an ordained priest and a consecrated bishop in the Ecclesia Gnostica Spiritualis, that is the universal Gnostic Church. So while I'm not like a Roman Catholic exorcist in a formal sense, yet I do carry the spiritual authority to perform rites of expulsion. In that light, the Star Ruby functioned exactly as an exorcism by purifying and dismissing adverse influences. And even if its method is mystical rather than sectarian. Now let's walk through the Star Ruby step by step, highlighting how it works and how it differs from the more familiar LBRP. This will also illuminate why I say there is so much more of it beyond just banishing. The structure of the Star Ruby mirrors the outline of a standard pentagram ritual in its banishing form, with some very distinctive twists. The exorcism opening. So as I mentioned, the Star Ruby begins with the magician facing east, being in the center of the circle, and performing an energetic sweeping gesture by proclaiming Apopantos Kakodaimonos. This is unique. The LBRP does not include unspoken exorcism at the start. In the Golden Dawn tradition, one might announce a heck, which means afar, afar, O profane ones, before any ceremony to achieve a similar effect. But it's not part of the LBRP's text. The Star Ruby explicitly begin by casting out intrusions, basically essentially telling any impure influence, leave this sacred space. This step also serves, potentially, to quiet the mind's distraction, or sort of like an elaboration of the sign of silence, in order to still the internal chatter and any obstacle to manifesting one's true will. In other words, this exorcism is aimed both at outer demons and inner ones. That is, could be unconscious fears, stray thoughts, anything that could hinder the work at hand. Then there's the cross, which is something analogous, once again, to the Kabbalistic cross performed in the LBRP. In the Star Ruby, however, the words are in Greek and heavily loaded with sexual mystical symbolism. So, touching one forehead, one says, which means thine, addressing the divine. Then, touching the genitals, one says, and this does not exactly mean the phallus. Crowley cleverly suggests to look at the numerology or gematria of this word to realize that in fact means both the phallus and the ctes, both sides of the alchemical union brought together. Sort of like looking at the generative principle from both genders and beyond it itself. Then one will touch the right shoulder, say is, which means strong, and the left shoulder, which means beneficent or graceful. And finally, clasping the hands at the heart and crying, yeah. This differs dramatically from the LBRP, although essentially it's the same formula, in order to functionally establish the microcosm of the Tree of Life within the magician. The name Iao that we vibrate at the end is a Gnostic divine name equated to the Hebrew Iao, can be seen as standing for essence, beginning, and end, essentially the all-encompassing deity. And so with this modified Kabbalistic cross, the Star Ruby aligns ourselves to our Holy Guardian Angel, and it invokes its life energy and wholeness in a very Thelemic, cosmically sexual way. It's sort of like a declaration that the creative divine power is within me and around me. Then you have the casting of the pentagrams in the four quarters, which is the core of any pentagram ritual. However, in the Star Ruby, you don't really draw any pentagram with your hands or with your magical weapons. You rather fling a pentagram that you've been visualizing in your head by using the signs of Horus, or the sign of the Enterer, that is the projective will, and then retreating in the sign of Harpocrates, or the signs of silence, to exemplify the silence of or receptive will at each quarter. The names vibrated are also not the Hebrew god names of the LBRP, but rather Thelemic holy names taken from the Thelemic canon. You have Therion in the east, Nuit in the north, Babalon in the west, and Hadit in the south. Therion is Greek and means beast, and it's the beast 666. And again, if some of you might recoil at this term, as I told you at the beginning of this video, the rabbit hole goes very deep. There's a lot more to analyze that I can do in this video. But just stay with me and realize that this is a representation of the creative energy and the active divine masculine. Nuit is the infinite goddess of the night sky. That is the divine feminine and the embodiment of all possibilities. Babalon is a very complex Thelemic idea, but let's say that is something that represents passion and liberation, the Scarlet Woman, and is also an aspect of the divine feminine receptive force. She is a lot more than that, however. Let's say that this is an early understanding of this very complex and much misunderstood figure. And finally, Hadit, which is the point of divine presence, described as the infinitesimally small point, the spark of life and motion, which is often depicted as a winged globe or a winged serpent as well. So by calling these four in the respective quarters, the Star Ruby replaces the archangels of the LBRP with Thelemic deities, let's call them deities for simplicity, which are example of the Eon of Horus. What we're doing is that we're essentially invoking the beast and Babalon, the male and female, along with Nuit and Hadit, the overarching goddess and the omnipresent point, to guard and empower the circle. In effect, the entire Thelemic cosmology is brought into play. After completing the circle, the magician returns to the center and performs a loud exaltation, Iopan, while making a series of dramatic gestures known as the signs of N.O.X. This section often surprises people because it feels like an ecstatic mini-invocation inserted into a banishing ritual. Pan is the Greek god of all nature, and here he represents all existence. And the word itself, Pan, means all. Crowley, in fact, instructs to cry out Eopan as an hymn or praise to Pan, which is called a paean. And they accompany to this series of strange gestures, the signs of N.O.X, which, without getting too technical, these are gestures symbolizing birth, death, and resurrection in a mystical sense, okay? And they're associated with Thelemic initiation grades that reach towards the supernal Bina on the Tree of Life. By performing them, the magician effectually is raising consciousness upward, beyond the personal self, and toward the universal divine. You can think that at this point, the magician, or rather the adept, reaches upwards towards the supernal, establishing a central column of spirit, connecting their center with the higher realm of understanding. And so, if in simpler terms, if that is possible, having cleansed the immediate environment with the pentagrams, the magician now invokes the power of all, Pan, and aligns themselves with the highest cosmic forces, thus transcending the ego. It's an ecstatic, transpersonal moment within the ritual. It has no parallel with the original LBRP. This is pure Thelema. And the inclusion of Pan and the N.O.X formula signals that the Star Ruby isn't just about banishing, it's also about the joyous union of the all and the embrace into the night of Pan, which is a sort of Thelemic metaphor for the mystical surrender of the self to the divine. Next, it comes a section, this time analogous to the LBRP famous part where it says, "Before me Raphael, behind me Gabriel." But instead of invoking such angels, the Star Ruby invokes four rather obscure Greek names: the Yungas, the Teletarchai, the Synokes, and the Daimones. And these derive from the Chaldean oracles, which are a set of ancient Neoplatonic mystical texts. They really aren't household names, but Crowley inserted them to serve as sort of guardians of the quarters in these rituals. But who are they? In late Neoplatonic cosmology, the Yungas, the Synokes, the Teletarchai, and the Daimones are the divine principles that facilitate the emanation of the universe. And you can think of them as initiators, maintainers, perfecters, and executors of the divine creative will, as it manifests through reality. Practically, you can think of them as analogous to the archangel, which are powerful entities guarding each direction, but conceptually, they tie the ritual to a more cosmic and maybe more philosophical framework. What they're doing is that they're connecting our circle to the very machinery of creation in Neoplatonic terms, rather than the traditional angels of scripture. So when I vibrate those names, I visualize mighty presences in the quarters, just as I would with Raphael, etc., but perhaps a little bit more abstract than angels. While reciting this name, the instructions say, extend the arms in the form of a tau, that is, a T-shaped cross. This cross-shaped stance in the form of the tau is highly significant, because the tau is associated with the planet Saturn and the Sephir of Bina, again, touching that super, and it subtly links back to the fact that we are just reached up to Bina with the N.O.X signs, and thus the magician stands in the form of a tau cross. What is doing really is emulating both the element Earth, grounded in the body, and the insight of Bina, that is cosmic understanding. It's a stance of completion and protection. It's in that position that we declare Fregegar perimu o aster tom pente. Again, this is Greek, for about me flames the pentagram, and in the column stands the six-rayed star, that is the hexagram. This closing statement is particularly beautiful to me, because it affirms that the pentagram, the microcosm, the five elements, mankind, blazes around me, but it's the hexagram, that is the macrocosm, the divine, which is established in the central column of my being. In other words, I could say something like, I have erected the axis mundi, and I'm centered between heaven and earth. And so I guess you can tell how much deeper the Star Ruby goes compared to a simple cleansing ritual. Yes, it absolutely works to clean the room of any unwanted guest, but it also engages the operator's higher spiritual aspirations. Let's highlight a few key ways in which the Star Ruby is so much more than a banishing. It is ultimately about aligning with your true will. By banishing destruction, outer and inner, by invoking the highest power, Yao, Pan, etc., you set your ego aside and let the true will, or divine will, flow. The opening exorcism can be seen not just as yelling at spooks, but as a commanding your own lesser impulses to get behind you so that your true will can take charge. If you want, look at it in psychological terms, it could be seen as a form of mental discipline and empowerment, which you use to assert sovereignty over your mind and your space. This is self-mastery, and it's central to why the ritual has lasting effects beyond the moment. It's training you to operate from your center with absolute clarity. There is also a component of sexual alchemy or union of opposites. At the very beginning, you have Ophale, and we talked about it, and Iao. You have Nuit and Hadit, you have Babalon. In looking at all of this, Crowley notes that Ophale here really signifies the regenerative life principle in all beings. And all these elements symbolizes the male and female generative powers together. The all began, as some say. The name Iao can also be interpreted as Isis and Osiris. Once again, a formula of death and rebirth. And thus the Star Ruby encapsulate the formula of the great work, that is the alchemical marriage of the opposite in its words. And again, it's clear that it's much more than just banishing. It's practically a moving meditation on cosmic unity through polarity. Before wrapping this video up, I would like to briefly compare it with a ritual of exorcism that you might be more familiar with. The very word exorcism immediately brings to mind a Catholic priest wielding a crucifix and holy water. Now, the Catholic rites of exorcism is a very complex ceremony which litanies of saints, psalms, gospel readings, and authoritative commands in the name of Jesus Christ to expel a demon from a person and a place. It is usually only employed in extreme cases of demonic possession, of spirit possession, and requires church authorization. In form and in philosophy, it's completely different from the Star Ruby. It's monotheistic and supplicatory, meaning that the priest calls upon God and Christ to do the casting out, asserting the church's authority over the demon. The Star Ruby, by contrast, and I would argue Thelema, by contrast, is magical, mystical, and declarative. The practitioners themselves, as a microcosm of the divine, commands the banishing. There's no pleading an external deity. It's the magician itself doing the active exorcism, drawing onto their own divine connections. For example, as we've seen multiple times already, both rites use powerful words. Begone evil spirit appears both in the Star Ruby and the Latin Christian exorcism. And both involve protective signs, the cross or the pentagrams and hex. And thus you could say that the Star Ruby is, to a ceremonial magician, especially a Thelemic ceremonial magician, such as I am, the same as to the rite of exorcism is to a Catholic priest. It is a formula to assert spiritual authority and to restore purity. I think that the Star Ruby is a brilliant example of how a ritual can be multi-layered and transformative. On a surface, it served me well as an exorcism in a spooky farmhouse in Pendle Hill with ultra-famous YouTubers. But what I was doing there was a lot more than just ghost busting. I was invoking my higher self. I was reaching out to the supernotes in order to bring down that fire from heaven and not just destroy everything that was there, but to rebalance everything that possibly was upset by a group of people running wild into the night in Pendle Hill. Crowley gave us this ritual to carry the light of the new year into even a basic act of cleansing the space. For anyone who's curious, I encourage you to read the ritual. It's publicly available. I will put the link below. And even to try it in a safe space. If you approach it with both reverence and with an experiential spirit, I think you will have a great experience with it. And so, for the time being, thank you for listening. Once again, please like, subscribe, hype, comment, share, and I'll see you in the next video. Do what thou wilt, shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law. Love and the will.